The sun was just starting to rise over the quiet town of Willow Creek. The streets were almost empty, only a few shopkeepers opening their stores and an old man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the bakery. It was the kind of town where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen, where life moved slow and people thought they knew everyone who passed through. On that morning, though, something unusual was about to take place, and the townspeople would never forget it. General Laura Bennett had returned to her hometown after many years. She was a woman of strong character, known in the military for her courage, her discipline, and her calm leadership during difficult missions. Yet when she walked through the streets of Willow Creek that morning, she was not wearing her uniform. She wore plain clothes, simple jeans and a jacket, and her hair was tied back casually. She wanted to blend in, to remember what it felt like to be just another face in the crowd. For her, it was not about medals or salutes today. It was about peace and quiet, and a chance to visit the little park where she had played as a child. As she walked along the road near the park, she saw an elderly man stumble and fall. His shopping bag rolled away and the loaf of bread inside dropped into the dirt. Laura immediately rushed forward. She knelt beside him and gently helped him sit up. The man was breathing heavily, holding his chest with one hand. She spoke in a calm and soothing voice, telling him to relax, to take deep breaths, and assuring him that he would be fine. She offered him her water bottle and waited until he looked a little steadier. People nearby noticed and a small group gathered, but instead of helping, some only whispered and stared. Among them was a pair of police officers who had been patrolling the area. They approached quickly, their expressions serious, and demanded to know what was happening. Laura explained simply that the man had fainted and that she was only helping him. She smiled politely, expecting them to be grateful that someone had stepped in. But instead, one of the officers frowned and asked for her identification. Laura reached into her pocket for her wallet, but it had slipped out earlier in the car. She calmly explained that she did not have her ID with her at the moment, but she gave her full name and said the man she was helping could confirm she had done nothing wrong. The old man, still weak, tried to speak, but the officer ignored him. The second officer folded his arms, shaking his head. They did not recognize the name Laura Bennett. To them, she was just another stranger who might be causing trouble. The first officer raised his voice, saying that suspicious people could not be trusted, especially around the elderly. Laura tried once more to explain, her tone still calm and respectful, but the officer cut her off. He accused her of pretending to help while secretly trying to harm or steal. The small crowd gasped at his words while the old man waved his hands weakly in protest, but the officers paid him no attention. By now, Laura could feel the tension rising. She knew from her years in service that situations like this could spin out of control if pride and arrogance were allowed to lead. She kept her voice steady, repeating that she meant no harm and suggested they call for a medical team instead of arguing. But the officer seemed determined to show his authority. With a smirk, he ordered her to stand up and step aside. When she did, he grabbed her arm roughly. His partner looked uncertain but followed his lead. The crowd grew larger. People whispered among themselves, some recording on their phones, but no one dared to speak up against the police. The officers dragged Laura a few steps away, and in a display of unnecessary force tied her hands behind her with a strap and pushed her against a tree at the edge of the park. They tied her loosely to the trunk, saying it was for safety, until they could check who she really was. To them, it was just a way to show power, but to the onlookers, it was a shocking and humiliating sight. Laura did not struggle. She did not raise her voice or fight back. Instead, she stood quietly, her head held high, her calmness almost unsettling to those watching. She knew she could easily overpower the officers if she wanted to. Years of training had made her stronger than both of them combined. But that was not the way. She believed in discipline and dignity, and she would not lower herself to anger. Her silence spoke louder than any protest could. The townspeople could see in her eyes that she was not afraid. The old man she had helped cried out weakly, insisting that she was innocent, but the officers brushed him aside. A few young people in the crowd muttered that the police had gone too far, but they stayed back, afraid of consequences. For Laura, it was a strange feeling. She had led soldiers into dangerous battlefields, commanded respect across nations, and stood before presidents. Yet here she was, treated like a criminal in her own hometown, tied to a tree while doing nothing but helping an old man. One boy in the crowd, no older than 12, watched carefully. He had noticed earlier when Laura had taken out a small visiting card to check the old man's pulse and placed it back into her jacket pocket. As the officers turned away for a moment, the boy approached quietly and whispered to her. "Ma'am, are you really in the army?" he asked, his eyes wide with both curiosity and fear. Laura gave a small nod, her calm smile never fading. She told him softly, "Do not be afraid. Just remember that kindness always matters." Then she let her eyes drop to her pocket where the card was. The boy understood instantly. He waited for the right moment, then quickly slipped his hand into the pocket and pulled out the card. On it was her full name, her title, and the contact number of the nearby base where she was scheduled to oversee a training exercise later that day. The boy hid the card and ran off toward the edge of town, his heart pounding with both fear and excitement. He knew he had to act fast even if no one else dared to. Back at the park, Laura continued to stand with quiet dignity. The police officers mocked her, saying that people like her thought they were above the law. She did not answer. The crowd remained tense, unsure whether to speak out or stay silent. But beneath that calm surface, change was already on the way. The boy's small act of courage had set something in motion, something the arrogant officers could not have imagined. For at that very moment, a call was being made to the military base, and soon, the quiet town of Willow Creek would echo with the sound of engines and boots, bringing with them the truth of who Laura really was. The crowd in the park had grown larger. People from the nearby shops and houses had come to see what the commotion was about. Some held their phones up, recording every moment. A few shook their heads in disapproval, but no one dared to step forward. The two police officers stood with their arms folded, acting as if they had done something heroic by tying Laura to the tree. The old man she had helped sat on a bench, his breathing still heavy, muttering that it was all a mistake. His weak voice was drowned out by the chatter of the onlookers and the arrogant remarks of the officers. Laura remained calm, her hands tied behind her. The bark of the tree pressed into her back, but she did not complain. Her eyes moved slowly across the crowd, watching every face, every gesture. She could sense the uneasiness. Many people knew the treatment was wrong, yet they kept their distance. She understood why. Fear of authority had silenced them. But she also knew that truth had its own way of rising when the moment was right. The first officer, a man with a thick mustache and a voice that carried across the park, spoke loudly to the crowd. He declared that the woman they had tied up was a stranger who had refused to provide identification. He claimed she had been behaving suspiciously and could be dangerous. His words were filled with pride, as if he expected applause. Instead, there was only uneasy silence. Some looked away, embarrassed, while others whispered to one another. A few people dared to murmur that the woman had only been helping the old man, but their voices were ignored. Laura listened without speaking. She could have shouted out her true identity, but she chose not to. Years of military discipline had taught her that dignity was more powerful than noise. She knew her soldiers were nearby, preparing for their training exercise outside town. She did not want to cause panic or show anger. Instead, she let the scene play out, trusting that truth would reveal itself. Her silence unsettled the officers even more. They expected fear or excuses, but her steady gaze made them uneasy. The second officer, younger and less confident, shifted on his feet. He glanced at Laura, then at the crowd, then back at his partner. Something about her calmness made him hesitate, but he remained quiet, unwilling to oppose his superior. He folded his arms and looked away, pretending to agree with everything being said. Inside, however, a doubt was growing. The humiliation deepened as the mustached officer paced in front of Laura like a performer on a stage. He wagged his finger in her face, saying that people who disobeyed the law had to be taught a lesson. Some children in the crowd gasped, holding their parents' hands tightly. The officer's words echoed through the park, but they carried no real weight. They sounded hollow compared to the quiet strength of the woman tied to the tree. Laura stood still, her head held high, her eyes steady. The contrast between her dignity and his arrogance was clear to everyone watching. Minutes passed, but to Laura they felt longer. The bark scratched at her wrists. The strap pressed against her skin, yet she refused to flinch. Instead, she remembered her soldiers, men and women who had followed her into danger, who had trusted her judgment, who had learned from her calmness in the face of fear. If she lost her composure now, the lesson she had lived by would be wasted. She whispered to herself silently, a reminder that true strength was not shown by anger but by patience. Meanwhile, the boy who had slipped away earlier was running as fast as his legs could carry him. The visiting card in his hand felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of the whole situation. He dashed through the streets past the bakery and the post office, toward the small phone booth near the edge of town. His chest heaved as he pushed the door open and dialed the number printed on the card. It rang only once before a deep voice answered, crisp and professional. The boy stammered at first, but then quickly explained what had happened. That a woman named Laura Bennett had been tied to a tree by the police in the town park. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then the voice asked firmly, "Are you sure of the name?" The boy confirmed. The line went quiet again, followed by a calm but urgent response. "Stay where you are, son. Help is coming." The call ended and the boy leaned against the booth, his heart racing. He had done his part. Back in the park, the situation dragged on. The old man grew restless, standing up despite his weakness. He tried to walk toward the officers, pointing at Laura and insisting she was innocent. His words were ignored once again. The mustached officer barked at him to sit down before he made things worse. The crowd murmured with disapproval, but no one dared step between authority and the woman they had humiliated. A light wind blew through the park, rustling the leaves of the tree. Laura closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the breeze against her face. It reminded her of the countless times she had stood under the open sky, waiting for orders, waiting for dawn, waiting for the next mission. Waiting required patience, and patience was something she had in abundance. Though tied, she felt freer than the men who mocked her. She was not trapped by pride or arrogance as they were. She was steady, and she knew the moment of change was drawing closer. The officers, growing more frustrated by her silence, began to mock her further. They laughed loudly, telling the crowd that criminals always acted calm when they were caught. Their voices echoed, but there was no laughter in response. The people watching had grown quiet. They saw the truth in her posture, in her stillness, in her eyes. The officer's words no longer carried the same weight. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if everyone sensed something was about to happen. Somewhere in the distance, faint at first, came the low hum of engines. No one in the park noticed it right away. The mustached officer was too busy boasting about authority, while his younger partner shifted uneasily, glancing toward the road. Laura heard it before anyone else did. Her trained ears recognized the sound, the steady rhythm of military vehicles. Her lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly, into a calm smile. She did not speak, but inside she knew. Her soldiers were near. The crowd stirred as the sound grew louder. Heads turned toward the street, eyes narrowing, wondering what it was. The younger officer frowned, tugging at his collar. The mustached officer waved his hand dismissively, saying it was nothing. But the sound grew into a roar, clear and undeniable. The ground seemed to tremble slightly beneath their feet. A boy in the front gasped, pointing at the horizon where dust began to rise. Laura stood tall, her heart steady. She did not move, did not speak. She simply waited. The engines were closer now, unmistakable. The townspeople began whispering, their voices filled with nervous curiosity. And then, at the end of the road, the first military truck appeared, its tires kicking up dust, its headlights cutting through the morning air. Behind it, more vehicles followed, one after another, a convoy rolling toward the park. Soldiers in uniform stood firm in the back, their expressions serious, their eyes locked on the scene ahead. Gasps spread through the crowd like a wave. Some stepped back in shock. Others raised their phones higher, capturing every moment. The officers froze, their confidence draining away as the realization struck. The mustached man stuttered, his face pale, his earlier arrogance vanishing in an instant. The younger officer looked at him with wide eyes, as if silently asking what they had done. The truth was clear now. The woman they had tied to a tree was no ordinary stranger. She was someone far greater than they could have imagined. Laura finally lifted her chin, her eyes steady on the approaching convoy. Her soldiers were here. Her silence had spoken louder than any protest could. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave the whole town in awe. The roar of the engines filled the quiet town. Dust rose in the air as the convoy rolled in, one vehicle after another. It was a sight no one in Willow Creek had expected to see that morning. Military trucks with bold markings came to a halt along the edge of the park. Soldiers in crisp uniforms jumped down with precision. their boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. The air shifted instantly. The playful whispers and half-hearted chatter of the crowd were replaced by silence and wide-eyed stares. Everyone knew something powerful was unfolding. Laura stood still, her back against the tree, her wrists still tied. She didn't need to call out. Her soldiers recognized her immediately. In an instant, their eyes locked on their general. Their expressions changed from steady focus to shock and anger. To see their leader, the woman who had guided them through countless missions, tied like a common criminal, it was unthinkable. A ripple of outrage moved through the formation, but none of them acted without orders. Discipline held them in place, their jaws clenched, their hands tightening into fists at their sides. The lead officer in the convoy, Colonel James Turner, stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the authority of a man who had stood beside Laura in many campaigns. His eyes burned as they settled on the sight before him. Laura bound to a tree, the smug police officer standing in front of her, and the restless townspeople watching. The colonel's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Who did this?" he demanded, his tone sharp and commanding. The crowd shifted nervously. All eyes turned toward the two police officers. The mustached officer's bravado crumbled instantly. His voice, once loud and mocking, now wavered. "This woman refused to identify herself," he stammered. "We were only doing our duty, keeping the peace." His words lacked the confidence they had carried minutes before. They sounded weak, flimsy, almost pitiful in the heavy air now filled with military presence. The younger officer took a step back, his face pale, regret painted across his features. He avoided Laura's gaze, ashamed. Colonel Turner's eyes narrowed. "Do you know who this is?" he asked, his voice steady but dangerous. The officer opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. He looked at Laura, then back at the colonel, then at the soldiers standing in formation behind him. For the first time, he realized the enormity of his mistake. This was not just another stranger. This was not some troublemaker from out of town. This was a general, the very person these soldiers saluted with pride and loyalty. The crowd gasped as whispers spread like fire. "A general?" someone muttered. "She's really a general?" Others pressed forward, craning their necks for a better look. Some felt shame for doubting her, for standing silent when she had been humiliated. Others were filled with awe, realizing that the calm, composed woman tied to the tree had been someone extraordinary all along. The atmosphere had shifted completely, and the truth was too powerful to deny. Laura finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, and clear. "Untie me," she said simply. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't anger. It was an order, spoken with quiet authority that left no room for hesitation. One of the soldiers nearest to her stepped forward immediately, unfastened the straps, and helped her free. Laura flexed her wrist slightly, the marks of the strap visible on her skin, but she didn't dwell on them. She simply straightened her jacket, brushed the dust from her sleeve, and stood tall, her presence commanding the entire park without effort. The mustached officer stumbled backward, his face red with fear. He tried to speak again, but his words failed him. The younger officer lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The old man, the one Laura had helped, let out a cry of relief and clapped his hands weakly together. "I told you," he said, his voice trembling but triumphant. "She was helping me. She's no criminal, she's an angel who saved me." The boy who had made the call stood near the edge of the park, his chest swelling with pride. He had played a part in bringing the truth to light. The soldiers closed ranks behind Laura, forming a wall of strength and loyalty. Their presence alone was enough to silence the crowd completely. Every pair of eyes was fixed on her, waiting for her next move. Laura looked at the officers who had humiliated her. She could have shouted at them. She could have ordered their arrest on the spot. Her authority gave her every right to do so. But instead, she chose restraint. Her voice was calm but firm as she spoke. Authority is not meant to be abused. Power is not meant to shame others. You have failed in both. Her words struck harder than any punishment. The mustached officer's shoulders slumped. The younger officer closed his eyes, his lips pressed tightly together. The shame was unbearable. The townspeople looked at Laura with newfound respect. They could see the difference between true authority and empty arrogance. One commanded respect with dignity. The other demanded obedience through fear. And now the difference was undeniable. Colonel Turner stepped closer, his voice lower but filled with weight. "General, give the word. We will handle them." His soldiers nodded as one, their loyalty shining through. The park seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her decision. Laura shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "We are not here to punish. Let the law deal with them. What matters is that the people understand what respect truly means." Her decision stunned the crowd. Even in the face of personal humiliation, she chose justice over revenge. That was the mark of true leadership. She turned to the young boy who had made the call. His eyes were wide, filled with awe. Laura knelt slightly so she could meet him at eye level. "You were brave," she told him, her voice gentle now. "You did what others were too afraid to do. Remember this. Courage is not about size or strength. It's about doing the right thing when it matters most." The boy's face lit up with pride, his small chest puffing out as the soldiers around him smiled softly. The crowd applauded, some wiping tears from their eyes. The military presence had transformed the park into a stage of justice. The once arrogant officers stood small and broken. The townspeople stood in awe, and Laura stood tall, her dignity unshaken. The soldiers' respect for her had only deepened. They saw in her not just a leader in battle, but a leader in spirit, a woman who could endure humiliation with grace and still rise above it without bitterness. The moment was unforgettable. The crowd knew they had witnessed something rare, something that would be spoken of for years to come. A woman of great power had been tied to a tree like a criminal, yet she had not raised her voice or lost her composure. And when the truth came, she did not strike back in anger. Instead, she gave a lesson in humanity and leadership that no one present would ever forget. The convoy remained in the park a little longer, the soldiers standing in perfect formation, their eyes on Laura. She gave them a slight nod, signaling that it was time to move on. They obeyed instantly, their movements sharp and disciplined. The townspeople stepped aside as the trucks prepared to leave, their respect for the general etched into their hearts forever. Laura walked at the front, her steps calm and steady, as if the humiliation she had endured moments earlier had only strengthened her resolve. The police officers were left standing alone, exposed in their failure. The law would deal with them later, but the judgment of the people had already been passed. Respect was not something that could be demanded with force. It was something earned through dignity, courage, and truth, and Laura Bennett had shown them all what that looked like. The tension in the park had not yet faded. The convoy of military vehicles stood like a wall of steel. Soldiers lined up with silent discipline, and the townspeople remained rooted in their places, still trying to process what they had witnessed. The two police officers, who had once acted with such arrogance, now looked like children caught in the middle of a storm. Their shoulders were hunched, their faces pale, and every word they tried to speak was swallowed by their own fear. They were waiting, like everyone else, for what the general would decide. Laura Bennett stood at the center of it all. Her presence was calm yet commanding, like a quiet flame that drew every eye. Her wrists still bore the faint red marks from where the straps had held her, but she ignored the discomfort. She looked not at her soldiers, not at the frightened officers, but at the people of Willow Creek, the town where she had grown up, the people who had once known her only as a young girl running through these very streets. Now they saw her as something else, a woman whose strength was not just in her rank but in her spirit. Colonel Turner stood at her side, waiting for her order. His men were ready, tense, their hands resting on their belts. They had been trained to follow commands instantly, and they were prepared to defend their general if she so wished. The townspeople, sensing the seriousness of the moment, held their breath. The entire scene balanced on a thread, and Laura's next words would decide everything. She stepped forward slowly, her boots pressing softly into the grass, and faced the two officers. The mustached one trembled, his earlier confidence shattered, while the younger one kept his head lowered, his shame too heavy to lift his eyes. Laura's gaze moved between them, not filled with rage, but with a kind of steady disappointment that was more powerful than anger. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm but not loud, measured yet commanding. "Stand down," she told her soldiers. Her men instantly obeyed, their formation loosening slightly, though their eyes never left the scene. The crowd exhaled in relief, realizing that no violence would erupt. Laura then turned back to the officers. "You tied me to that tree," she said evenly. "You mocked me in front of these people. But it was not me you disrespected. It was your badge, your duty. and the very trust you swore to uphold." Her words were sharp, not with anger but with truth, and the silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The officers' faces burned with shame. They had no reply because every word she spoke was undeniable. The townspeople murmured softly. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing how easily they too had stood back and allowed the scene to unfold without protest. Laura's calm but cutting words held a mirror to everyone present. Authority was meant to protect, not to humiliate, and in failing to see that, the officers had revealed the weakness of their character. The younger officer finally raised his head slightly, his lips trembling. We didn't know who you were," he whispered, almost pleading. Laura held his gaze unblinking. "And that," she replied, "is exactly the point. Respect is not about who a person is. Respect is about every person, old or young, weak or strong, uniformed or not." The crowd broke into quiet applause, the sound spreading through the park until it swelled like a wave. Parents looked at their children, as if reminding them silently to remember these words for the rest of their lives. Colonel Turner stepped forward, his expression stern. "General," he said, "these men should be taken into custody for what they have done. Give the order, and we will see to it immediately." His soldiers shifted slightly, ready to move. The officers froze, panic flashing in their eyes. But Laura raised her hand gently, signaling for restraint. "No," she said. "They will not be dragged away today. Let the law take its course. Let the people who saw this decide what kind of officers they want protecting their town. Justice will find its way without us forcing it." Her words carried not just wisdom but also mercy. It was a lesson in leadership, a reminder that strength was not in crushing others but in rising above them. The soldiers behind her stood even taller, their pride in their general burning brighter than ever. They knew they served someone who led not just with authority but with heart. Laura then turned toward the crowd. Her voice softened, but it still carried clearly. "You all stood here today and watched. Some of you recorded, some of you whispered, some of you stayed silent, and I do not blame you for being afraid. But I ask you this. If you see someone treated unjustly tomorrow, will you remain silent again? Or will you stand up? Not because you know their name, but because it is the right thing to do." The crowd was silent at first, her question echoing in their hearts. Then slowly heads began to nod. A man at the back shouted, "Never again!" Others clapped, and soon the entire park was alive with agreement. It was not just a response, it was a promise. The young boy who had made the call to the base stood shyly at the edge of the soldiers. Laura walked over to him, her step steady, her expression softening into a smile. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "This boy," she said to the crowd, "saw what others did not. He saw wrong and had the courage to act. He is proof that courage does not wait for age. It comes from the heart." The boy's eyes widened with pride, and the crowd cheered for him, their applause filling the air. His mother, standing nearby, covered her mouth with her hands, tears running down her cheeks. The soldiers, still lined up, shifted their posture as Laura raised her hand in salute. Instantly, every man and woman in uniform snapped to attention and saluted back. The townspeople gasped at the sight. For them, it was not just a military gesture. It was a moment of respect, of unity, of truth revealed in front of their eyes. The general they had seen humiliated was now standing taller than ever, surrounded by the unwavering loyalty of her troops. The police officers lowered their heads further, unable to face the weight of what they had done. Their punishment would come later, but their shame had already begun. The people of Willow Creek would never forget the day they saw two men misuse their authority, only to be exposed by the dignity of a woman they had tried to humiliate. The convoy engines started again, the sound deep and steady, as if echoing the heartbeat of the moment. Laura gave one final look at the crowd, her eyes filled with both strength and compassion. Then she turned and began walking toward the lead vehicle. Her soldiers followed in perfect step, their boots striking the ground like thunder. The crowd parted silently, making way for her. It was not fear that moved them aside, but respect, the kind that no badge or weapon could demand. As she climbed into the vehicle, the townspeople broke into applause again. Some cheered, some wiped tears from their eyes, some simply stood in awe. They had witnessed something they would tell their children and grandchildren. The day a general was tied to a tree, humiliated in front of all, and yet walked away not broken, but greater than before. They would remember how her soldiers came like a storm, but she chose calm. They would remember how she held power but chose mercy, and most of all they would remember the lesson she had left behind, that respect must live in the heart, not just in the uniform. The convoy pulled out slowly, the vehicles rolling past the crowd. The townspeople waved, some even saluting awkwardly, their admiration shining through. The boy ran alongside for a few steps, grinning from ear to ear, before stopping to watch as the trucks disappeared down the road. His small hand clutched the visiting card she had given him, now a treasure he would never let go of. In the park, only silence remained. The tree where Laura had stood was still there, but it no longer looked like a place of humiliation. It looked like a monument, a reminder of dignity in the face of injustice. The people knew that from this day forward, things in Willow Creek would never be the same. They had seen what true leadership looked like, and it had left a mark on every soul present. The road stretched out in front of the convoy, and the town of Willow Creek slowly faded into the distance. Inside the lead vehicle, General Laura Bennett sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her soldiers sat around her, their eyes full of respect. Not one of them spoke, but the silence carried a weight that was louder than words. They were still processing what they had seen, the sight of their general tied to a tree by men who should have known better, and the way she had carried herself with unshakable dignity. Colonel Turner sat beside her. His hands were folded, his jaw set tight as if he were still holding back the anger he had felt when he first saw her tied up. Finally, he spoke. "General, with your permission, I would like to file immediate charges against those officers. Their behavior was a disgrace." His voice trembled with controlled fury. "You should not have endured that." Laura turned her head toward him, her expression calm. "I endured nothing I could not handle," she replied softly. "They tied my hands, but they could not touch my dignity. And that is what matters." The colonel wanted to argue, but he stopped. He knew she was right. He had followed her for years, through deserts and mountains, through missions where survival was uncertain. He had seen her steady hand guide soldiers in chaos. Now in this small town, she had proven once again that her strength was not just in command but in character. He nodded slowly, the tightness in his shoulders easing. Behind them, the soldiers exchanged glances. Some still looked angry, their fists clenched, but others smiled faintly, proud of their leader's wisdom. They knew the story of this morning would spread, not just through the town but beyond. It would travel from mouth to mouth, and eventually, it would reach ears far from Willow Creek. The lesson Laura had given would outlast the humiliation she had suffered. Back in the town, the people lingered in the park long after the convoy had gone. Parents spoke softly to their children, explaining what they had seen. The old man who had collapsed earlier sat with the boy who had made the call, patting his shoulder proudly. "You were brave," he told him. "Remember this day, because one act of courage can change everything." The boy nodded, his eyes still glowing with pride. For him, it had been the adventure of a lifetime, but it was also a lesson that would shape the man he would one day become. The tree where Laura had been tied stood silent, its bark rough, the rope still hanging loosely from its trunk. People passed by, staring at it as though it were no longer just a tree but a witness to something extraordinary. Some whispered prayers, some touched the trunk as if paying respect, and others took photographs. It became in that moment a symbol, not of humiliation but of resilience, a reminder that dignity cannot be bound. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. Videos recorded by bystanders surfaced, showing the moment the military convoy had arrived and the soldiers had surrounded the park. Millions watched as Laura was untied and stood tall, her calmness unshaken. News reporters arrived in Willow Creek, filling the streets, eager to speak with the townspeople who had witnessed it firsthand. The two officers who had tied her to the tree faced suspension, and an investigation began. The younger one admitted his regret publicly, saying he had been afraid to speak against his superior. The mustached one tried to defend his actions but found no support. The people had already decided. They wanted accountability and they wanted change. Laura, however, did not dwell on punishment. She gave no angry speeches, no harsh demands. When reporters asked for her comment, she simply said, "Respect belongs to every person. If we cannot show it in small places, then it means nothing in large ones." Her words were repeated in newspapers, on television, and across countless conversations. People admired her humility. Leaders in other towns cited her example in meetings, reminding their officers of what true authority should look like. Back at her base, Laura gathered her soldiers. She addressed them not as a superior scolding subordinates, but as a leader guiding hearts. "What happened in Willow Creek will be remembered," she told them. "Not because of the humiliation, but because of how we responded to it. We must always remember, we are here to serve, not to dominate. To protect, not to humiliate. Never forget that the world watches us, not when things go smoothly, but when we are tested." Her words were met with solemn nods and quiet pride. Her soldiers felt stronger than ever under her command. Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, the young boy became somewhat of a local hero. Teachers at his school praised him for his courage. Neighbors smiled when they saw him, calling him the boy who made the call. His mother held him a little tighter at night, proud that her son had shown more bravery than many adults that day. He still carried Laura's visiting card in his pocket, worn at the edges now, but to him, it was more valuable than gold. The old man recovered from his fainting spell and often told the story to anyone who would listen. He described how the woman who had helped him was treated unjustly, but how she rose above it with grace. He spoke of the soldiers arriving like thunder, and the way the crowd learned that day what true respect meant. His voice shook with emotion every time he told it, and people listened, touched by the lesson hidden in the events. The park itself became a place of quiet reflection. People often stopped at the tree to take pictures or simply to stand there for a moment in silence. It reminded them not just of what had happened, but of how they had all been changed by it. Parents used it as a lesson for their children. "See that tree? That's where the general stood. She didn't shout. She didn't fight back. She stayed calm. That's real strength." Months later, Laura returned to Willow Creek, this time in her full uniform. She came not with a convoy, but with only a few soldiers. The town gathered to welcome her, their applause filling the streets. The mayor offered her a plaque of honor, and the townspeople cheered as she accepted it with her quiet smile. But Laura, true to her nature, shifted the honor. "This recognition," she said, "belongs not just to me, but to the boy who acted, to the old man who spoke the truth, and to every person who has the courage to stand against injustice. May we all learn to respect one another no matter who we are." The crowd erupted with cheers, tears glistening in many eyes. For Laura, the experience was more than just an incident. It became a reminder that leadership was not about medals, titles, or uniforms. It was about showing calm in chaos, about choosing mercy when anger was easy, and about teaching others that respect cannot be demanded. It must be given freely. She carried that lesson with her, and so did her soldiers. They spoke of it often, proud to serve under someone whose example was more powerful than any command. The story of Willow Creek lived on long after the dust settled. It was retold in classrooms and town meetings, in quiet conversations at dinner tables. The phrase "respect is for everyone" became a kind of motto, a lesson passed down from that day. And though Laura never sought fame, her name carried weight wherever it was mentioned. People said she was the kind of leader the world needed, strong, calm, and full of grace. As for the tree, it remained standing in the park, its trunk scarred slightly by the straps that had once bound her. But instead of being a mark of shame, it became a symbol of resilience. Families brought their children there, pointing to it and saying, "That's where dignity defeated humiliation." And every time the wind rustled its leaves, it seemed to whisper the lesson Laura had left behind. That true strength does not shout, it does not crush, it does not demand. True strength stands tall even when tied down. And so the story ended not with anger, but with hope. A town had been changed, a boy had been inspired, and a general had shown the world that even in humiliation, dignity can shine brighter than pride. It was a story of respect, of courage, and of the kind of leadership that leaves its mark forever.